think. Happy Friday, everybody. Feeling all right? Good. So before, Omar, you had a question, and I'll get to it in just a second. But first I want to make sure, are we all clear on exactly what it is that you're being asked to do for this argument analysis draft assignment that's due tonight at midnight? One of the reasons why I ask is I've been getting a couple of emails from folks that seem to be a little bit unclear, and some of that might be on me for, well, I'll explain why in a second. What you're being asked to do is to give me an argument analysis on this topic of whether or not it's morally permissible to eat a cheeseburger under normal circumstances. I'm not asking you to do it on whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich. I'm also not asking you to make up your own topic and do arguments about that. The reason why that might be confusing was there was a question on the last homework assignment where there was, and this was a holdover from past semesters where I was asking students to come up with their own topics, and I've since kind of moved away from that because people were coming up with topics that were really weird and hard to work with. So I've been picking the topics for us this semester and will continue to do so for the rest of the semester. So it's about cheeseburgers, and your argument analysis should have three major parts. The first part is give me the best available argument for why we might think that it is not morally permissible to eat a cheeseburger. Part 2, give me the best available argument for why we think it is morally permissible. And part 3, tell me which of those two arguments is the better argument and why, which is in fact to say, give me a third argument. And the conclusion of that argument should be which of the two is the better argument. Within those three major parts, for each of them, there are three subparts. The first one is give me a bare bones, kind of almost bullet pointy premise 1, premise 2, conclusion sort of version of the argument. Then, if you can, tell me what kind of argument it is and why it's compelling. So for example, if you were making an argument by analogy, you'll say, this is an argument by analogy. The two analogs are kitten head stomping because I like the sound and cheeseburger eating because I like the taste. And it's compelling because there's an established similarity that's supposedly relevant between the two analogs. And that similarity is relevant to the conclusion that I'm drawing. If, for example, I gave an argument that started from a premise like this. If the harms outweigh the benefits, you shouldn't do it. The harms of eating a cheeseburger outweigh the benefits. Therefore, you shouldn't do it. That's a modus ponens argument. It's compelling because it's valid. So long as all the premises are true, the conclusion would have to be true. And then, last but not least, give me just a normal prose version of that argument, like you're writing a letter to a friend or like you're talking to somebody. Just kind of put it in natural language instead of bullet points for me. Make sense? Yes?
Are our arguments responding to your original argument?
Not necessarily. That original argument was just to get us started, but that doesn't necessarily have, it might not be one of the best available arguments, one way or the other. You might say, I think there are stronger arguments for why you shouldn't eat a cheeseburger, right? The argument that I gave, that argument by analogy about the kitten heads, was for the idea that you should not eat the cheeseburger, and maybe you use that one if you're pressed for time, or if you may genuinely think it's the best available argument. You may just say he already made an argument, seems pretty good, I'll use that one. All right, that's a little bit lazy. But yeah, you can use it. You don't have to use it, though. Yep. Anything else? All right. So, Omar, you had this question about what the difference between an enumerative generalization and a statistical syllogism is. Were the ones that you were confusing the most, right? And that's understandable because they're both articulating some sort of relationship between a general rule and a particular case, right? Or something like, or several particular cases. The difference between them is which way the argument goes. A statistical syllogism starts with a key premise that is a general rule, and then the rest of the argument is identifying that here's a particular case that fits the rule, so let's apply the rule to the particular case. The conclusion is going to be the application of that general rule to the particular case, whereas in an enumerative generalization, my conclusion is the general rule. I'm going from a bunch of particular cases as my premises, and I'm drawing a conclusion that says, therefore, most A's are B's, or something like that, right? So it's this question of, am I arguing from the general rule to a particular case, or am I arguing from particular cases to the general rule? I tend to think, for some reason, I don't know, maybe this is like a holdover from like medieval metaphysics. Maybe I just read too much philosophy. I tend to think of it as like an up or down sort of thing. The general rule's up here. The particular cases are down here on the ground. So are you arguing down from the general rule to the particular case, or are you arguing up? And the argument by analogy argues sideways on the ground. We don't even mess with the general rules at all. Yes?
There was one question on the that confused me. It was about the Nestle food thing. And it was saying that they polled a bunch of people and everybody said they really liked it. So they said everybody loved it.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, that product is a hit for the company. And I thought, well, it's a similar outcome that, it's, so that for the hit, so therefore the rule is that
But does does that argument say everybody loved it, therefore it's a hit? Or are we saying because the people who sent in the surveys liked it, therefore everybody loved it, aka it's a hit? Does that make sense? So if we say everybody loved it, to then say it's a hit isn't an application of the general rule everybody loved it to a particular case. It almost seems like it's just it's another way of saying that everybody loved it. What makes something a hit as a product? If everybody loves it, right? So yeah, maybe there's a little bit of confusion there. It seemed like what was making that argument tick was to say, we got all of these survey responses. They all said they loved it. Therefore, everybody loves it. Everybody who submitted the survey loves it. Therefore, everybody loves it. That's a generalization, right? And in fact, it's a sketchy one, too, because we think that the people who submit the survey was included on the product. So first of all, you've already selected only for people who have already bought the product. Second of all, maybe your sample is biased because who's going to send in a survey? Do you guys ever, if you find a survey on your products that you buy, do you fill them out and send them in? I don't, unless I feel really strongly, right? So yeah, maybe there's a little bias in the sampling there as well. So yeah, it's not a particularly good argument, and it seems like it's a generalization, generalizing from the people who responded to the survey to everybody. Okay, anything else? Today, we're talking about fallacies again. Maybe for, one of the last ones, we might check back in on this again, but we're kind of going to cover almost all the ground in these fallacy files. So far, we've done these 4 different families of fallacies. We started out talking about formal fallacies. What makes a fallacy a formal? Well, actually, before we even get into what makes a fallacy a formal fallacy, what's a fallacy? Yeah, there, you guys reads good. A bad argument that at first glance looks better than it actually is. Exactly. So it's not just a bad argument, it's like a sneaky bad argument, right? All these fallacies they're kind of masquerading as better than they actually are. And if you're not really careful, you won't catch it. If you're not paying attention, you won't catch it. So formal fallacies are bad arguments, they're sneaky in some sort of way. What makes a fallacy a formal fallacy? For example, one of the formal fallacies that we discussed was affirming the consequent, where I have an argument that goes, if A, then B, B, therefore A. And we said, that's actually not a very good argument, and it's a little bit sneaky because it looks a little bit like a good argument. What makes that argument a formal fallacy as opposed to some other sort of fallacy? I'll give you a hint. There's something in the name. Formal fallacy.
It sounds like it's formal logic.
Yeah, or what is when we talk about formal logic, anybody know, what makes formal logic formal? It's a focus on the form of the argument, the structure of the argument, rather than its content. Was that where you're going to say something like that? Yeah, so there's something gone wrong with the form or the structure of the argument. What's wrong with if A then B, B therefore A, is that if you just kind of switch some things around, that would work. If it was if A then B, A therefore B, piece of cake, that's a valid argument at least, right? That's modus ponens. If A then B, B therefore A, its structural form is just a little bit off. That's affirming the consequent. And all of my formal fallacies are like that. It's something that's wrong with the structural form, not with the content. It resembles a common valid argument, but we've moved some of the pieces around, and that's what makes it not a good argument and also a little bit sneaky. What about fallacies of relevance? That's maybe like so obvious as to not warrant a serious question. What makes fallacies of relevance fallacies of relevance? The premises are not particularly relevant to the conclusion being drawn. Maybe this will be more interesting. Remind me, what were some of the fallacies of relevance that we discussed? What are some examples of fallacies of relevance? Ad hominem is one, yeah. When we're talking about the person's character is not relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn. You should get off the swings. No, I shouldn't, because you're a poo-poo head. You're like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, whether or not I'm a poo-poo head is not relevant to whether or not you should get off the swings. So yeah, ad hominem fallacy. That's why it's not a very good argument. Sometimes bringing the argument to the character is relevant. But when it's not, we've committed this fallacy. And that's what makes it sneaky. Sometimes it's relevant, sometimes it's not. Some other fallacies of relevance that we discussed? Yes? Ad misericordiam, which is an appeal to pity, right? When we say that, like, yeah, your sadness is not relevant to whether or not I should do this or something else. Yeah, anything else? Yes? Ad baculum, which is it's a threat, right? An appeal to force. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, the fact that you're bigger and stronger than me is not relevant to whether or not you're right. Yeah. Ad populum, similar. The fact that an idea is like widely believed is not necessarily relevant to whether or not it's true. Any others? Well, we got an idea, right? These are all fallacies of relevance. Fallacies of presumption include things like, ooh, how are we doing with this? What are some examples of fallacies of presumption? Yes?
False dilemma.
Yeah, false dilemma is a fallacy of presumption where I'm assuming that I only have these two options in an either-or premise, like you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, right? And that assumption is what kind of like gets me to a point where I can make some very powerful, good-seeming arguments or seemingly good arguments, when in fact I've snuck this assumption in the back door and it makes the argument weaker than it actually seems, or actually weaker than it seems. Begging the question, another fallacy of presumption where what's being presumed or assumed in this case is that the conclusion is already true. I assume the conclusion is true in order to give you reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. No, that's not how that works. That's a bad argument. Fallacies of ambiguity include all of those cases where I have kind of like mushy, vague, ambiguous sorts of terminology or sentence structure. We discussed equivocation as one. Yeah, Aman, you got another? Equivocation. Amphiboly is one that's similar to equivocation. Equivocation is about when the word meaning is a little bit ambiguous, when it changes throughout the argument. And amphiboly is about ambiguous sentence structure. You can remember some of these examples like, I shot an elephant in my pajamas. What was the elephant doing in your pajamas kind of thing, right? Yeah. There are no words that are ambiguous there. It's the sentence structure that's a little ambiguous. What else? Fallacy of composition, fallacy of division, also a fallacy of ambiguity. All right, so those are the four families that we've already discussed. Today we're going to be talking about fallacies of weak induction. And surprise, surprise, all of these involve inductive arguments gone wrong. There's going to be one family that I'm just going to kind of gesture towards because we haven't started talking about these arguments yet. And the reason why we haven't started talking about them just yet is I'm not 100% convinced that they're actually inductive arguments. They're definitely likely inferences, but they may be a different class of likely inferences than induction. But yeah, we'll go ahead and toss them into this family, fallacies of weak induction, because they all involve some sort of likely inference that's not as strong as it seems like it is. The first few that we're going to look at are going to be kind of obvious, mostly just because we've covered this territory already when talking about what makes inductive arguments work well. A lot of these fallacies are just going to be, yeah, it's an inductive argument that's not done well. For example, hasty generalization. A hasty generalization is an enumerative generalization that's just not done very well. I make my generalization too hastily, too quickly, on too little evidence or on not good enough evidence. My sample size is too small. My sample is biased. I'm skipping to my general rule before I've actually offered actually compelling evidence that that general rule is the sort of thing that I should be confident in. For example, after the debate, the reporter interviewed 10 people and asked them to discuss their impressions. 7 of those 10 thought the incumbent won. 1 was undecided. 2 thought the challenger won. It looks like the incumbent is more popular with the people. How good an argument is that? Not very? Yeah, not very good. And why? Because I'm trying to generalize from 10 people to all Americans, and that's just too small of a sample size. We get why that's not a good argument? We get why we would call it a hasty generalization? It's an attempt to make a generalization on too little evidence. Compare that to accident, sometimes known as a sweeping generalization, and it might be easy to confuse these two, just like it's easy to confuse statistical syllogism and a generalization. If we can think of hasty generalization as an enumerative generalization gone wrong, we can think of sweeping generalization, or the fallacy of accident, as a statistical syllogism gone wrong. Starts out with a premise that's kind of the form, most A's are B's, and where it goes wrong is that it just seems not sensitive enough to the possibility that the case that we're applying this general rule to is an exception to the rule rather than something that fits the rule. For example, I think it's not controversial to say that if you let somebody borrow something, they should return it when you ask for it back. Before we go through any more of that argument, does that seem like a reasonable sort of thing to say? If you let somebody borrow something, when you ask for it back, they should give it back. If they don't give it back when you ask for it back, they're not really borrowing it anymore. It seems like they've stolen it. Okay, fair enough. I lent Brian my pistol last week, but now I'm angry at my neighbor and I want the pistol back so I can threaten my neighbor. Brian should totally give me my pistol back. I agreed with that general rule at the beginning, but I don't know about you. Are you not entirely convinced that Brian should give me my pistol back? Maybe what we want to say is, usually when you let somebody borrow something, when you ask for it back, they should give it back. There are some exceptions to the rule. What sorts of exceptions? Well, that looks like a pretty good case, actually, when giving it back would lead to some sort of harmful consequence, right? That general rule is one that applies most of the time, but it doesn't apply every time. And this argument just seems to be oblivious to or insensitive to the possibility that there are exceptions to the rule and that the case in question is precisely one of the cases that the exceptional case, that like the exception to the rule is exceptional for, right? All right. So this is a statistical syllogism gone wrong. Starts with a general rule, applies that general rule to a particular case, and does so with an insensitivity as to whether or not the particular case really does fit the rule or should count as an exception to it. Bing! Slothful induction, which is, this one's new. We haven't really talked about this one just yet. It's kind of maybe an important thing to mention. Slothful induction refers to a failure to make an inductive leap when the inductive leap is actually really well supported. And maybe you know somebody like this. Here's my friend Roberto, who has had 5 car accidents in the past 6 months. And he was driving in every single one of them. And I say, hey, Roberto, you should probably be a little bit more careful when you drive. And Roberto says, that's just a coincidence that I had 5 accidents in 6 months. Just bad luck. Do you know anybody like this? Like, bad shit keeps happening to them, and you're like, this seems like a pattern. And they're like, it's not a pattern. It's just bad luck. They're not being reasonable. There's ample evidence for them to identify that there's some sort of reliable pattern going on, and they're just saying, like, nah, I don't think there is a pattern. This is fallacious. One of the things that makes it tricky is that it's true that no sort of inductive inference is ever going to be absolutely certain. There's always going to be a possibility that there is no real pattern, that it is a coincidence, that it is just bad luck. That's always a possibility in any kind of inductive argument. But that doesn't mean that it's a probability. It doesn't mean that it's a reasonable sort of thing to assume. So it's trading on this idea that somehow like being cautious is wise and prudent, when we can see that sometimes being too cautious is a really, really bad idea. When there's ample evidence that like there's a pattern going on and somebody's just like, I don't believe it. You're like, nah, you're just not being reasonable. Weak analogy should be pretty straightforward. What makes an analogy work? When there are compelling, relevant similarities between the two analog cases. What makes it not work? When those similarities aren't particularly relevant, or when there are relevant differences that are being ignored. Here's an interesting case that actually the last section had trouble parsing this one and trying to figure out what was actually wrong with it. While it's true that the chemical chlordane, which is found in many insecticides, has been shown to cause cancer, it seems a bit rash to say that we should ban its use. After all, automobiles are responsible for tens of thousands of deaths each year, but nobody seems to think that we should ban cars. Is it clear that this is an argument by analogy? And the two things that are being compared are cars and insecticides with chlordane. Chlordane's a chemical, right? Not Claire Danes. She's an actress. Chlordane. Did I just show my age? Do you guys even know who Claire Danes is? Yeah. Okay, good. What's similar between these two cases? They both kill people. All right, there's a similarity. Is that the only relevant similarity? Maybe there are some other similarities. Is that similarity relevant to the conclusion that I'm drawing?
Somewhat.
A little bit. Yeah, it's like it should be part of the conversation, right? If I'm like, are these two things comparable with respect to whether or not we should ban them? And somebody says, well, they both kill people. And we'll be like, whether or not something kills people is probably something we want to think about when we're deciding whether or not to ban something. All right, good. Relevant similarity. Are there relevant dissimilarities here? Yes. What are they?
How much help the job they do.
Yeah, what's the job that they do?
People
One's transporting people, the other one's
killing bugs.
killing bugs so that people can eat.
Yeah.
But that's pretty important, I suppose.
But there might be more options.
That's
How do you kill?
true. Yeah, so we say not all insecticides have chlordane. We're just talking about banning the ones that do contain chlordane. If you banned those, you would still have some other insecticides. You could engage in other sorts of farming practices where you don't use any insecticides at all, maybe. They might be a little more expensive. They might not be as effective. But you can do it in a way that doesn't kill people.
It's one of those utilitarian arguments.
Perhaps, yeah. Would we say this? Well, this is an argument by analogy, so it's not necessarily going to be utilitarian, but sure.
You know what I mean, like to decide whether or not it's as...
The difference might be different sorts of utility, right? Yeah,
You said the difference between the two is one is more helpful to,
that's right.
One is beneficial.
They both have benefits and harms, but the balance is different for them. Yeah, okay. So what about the cars? Are there alternative ways to get around town besides a car? Ooh. But they're maybe not as effective? We could say that about insecticides as well. What other sorts of relevant differences might there be here? So yeah, so we've identified some good ones. One that like we could ban the insecticides and still be able to grow our crops. Whereas if we banned cars, it might be hard. And this might depend on what city you live in, right? Like you can walk, you can ride a bike, but I don't know, like if you live in High Point and work in Greensboro and go to school in Winston-Salem, you going to bike everywhere? You going to take the bus everywhere? Maybe you need a car, right? Also, consider this. Is there a way of using those chlordane insecticides properly that doesn't kill people? Or is it just, using them properly means spray it on the plants. And if you sprayed it on the plants, now the crops are going to be poisonous to the people who eat them? If you operate a car, if everybody who operates a car does so responsibly, can we bring down the number of deaths? Yeah, so that might be an important difference between the two. That one of the reasons why we accept car deaths is because we still are holding out this hope that like maybe if people drive responsibly, we can keep this down. And we don't really have that option with the insecticides. There's also the issue of the public isn't necessarily aware that what they're eating might give them cancer. Whereas if you get in a car, are we all fairly cognizant of the fact that you're taking a little bit of a risk every time you drive or ride in a car? Okay. There are some differences here, and they're important ones. And to the extent that there are important, relevant dissimilarities between these two analog cases, that makes this analogy a weak analogy. Appeal to unqualified authority is a fallacy that refers to, whenever it is that I say that somebody's testimony is trustworthy because they are an expert, because they have some sort of authority or access to information that's better than other people. And this can be a very good argument. Sometimes people will say any appeal to authority is fallacious. Those people are crazy. Because I don't know about you, but like I totally believe that carbon has 6 protons, even though I've never checked myself. Do you believe this as well? Carbon has 6 protons. You might even be like, I don't know, like, you say so. Like, look it up on your phone if you want. Does carbon have 6 protons? And why do you believe that? Is it because you trust the people who say so? Because they seem like they know that sort of thing. If the meteorologists tell you that it's going to rain tomorrow, and I say, all right, so I think it's going to rain tomorrow, and somebody's like, oh, what, just because the people who are experts say so? You'd be like, yeah, that's exactly why I think so. And we could say, like, well, I got my friend over here, he says it's not going to rain. And we might say, like, well, why should I trust him? And you're like, I don't know, because he's got a cool haircut and he's a good dancer? I'm like, no, that's not relevant, right? So one of the reasons, so this could be classified, by the way, as a fallacy of relevance, where we could say, like, you might have some expertise or you might have some authority, but it's just not related to what we're talking about. Or we could talk about it as a fallacy of induction, because a lot of times when we talk about an appeal to authority, we're doing so on the basis of somebody's got a track record, right? People who have that sort of background knowledge tend to be right more often than not when they talk about the things that are relevant to the background knowledge that they have. Or they might actually have a track record. We'll say, like, this meteorologist has been predicting the weather for 10 years, and he's right more often than he's wrong. Or she's right more often than she's wrong. Therefore, there's a pattern. I expect the pattern to persist. This is an inductive leap that I'm making. But when the authority that's being appealed to is just not relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn, clearly we get into trouble. So our example here, Tim says, I'm concerned about the amount of gluten that we've been eating. And Daniel says, why, do you have celiac disease or something? And Tim says, no. But Dr. Elizabeth on TV says that gluten can be dangerous for anyone. And Daniel says, Dr. Elizabeth, what is she, like some sort of gastroenterologist, somebody who specializes in digestive issues? And Tim says, no, she has a doctorate in English literature, but she's super smart. You should totally check her out. Why is Dr. Elizabeth not trustworthy? On this issue? Yeah, her disciplinary expertise is not relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn. And this is what makes it fallacious. And my guess is you've seen something like this before. Lots of people, like, go on the radio or go on TV and they're like, oh, Dr. So-and-so. Ooh, Dr. So-and-so, how impressive. Like, doctor of what? What sort of expertise do they have? I want to pay attention to that sort of thing. The gambler's fallacy. There's a nice little inductive fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is tricky because it seems like it plays on something that is like a good premise to work on, something we might talk about as a law of averages or laws of large numbers or something like this. If I flip a coin, like an ordinary fair coin, just a quarter that I pulled out of my pocket, if I flip it 500 times in a row, what do you think, like, how many of those times are going to come up heads and how many of them are going to be tails? Ballpark. Quarter flip 500 times in a row? This is not a brain buster, folks. Let's back this up. What are the odds on any one coin toss? 50-50, right? Which means 500 times in a row, probably going to get somewhere in the ballpark of 250 heads, 250 tails. That's a reasonable thing to expect because the odds are 50-50 for every one toss. If I've been on a streak, if I flip a quarter 10 times in a row and it came up heads every time, do you feel like maybe the next one's probably going to be tails? Yeah, it feels like you're overdue. Yeah, because eventually it's going to balance out, right? Yeah, this is what this fallacy preys on. This expectation that's like, that streak is unnaturally strong. It's got to break. It's probably going to break this time. The fact of the matter is, though, for any one coin toss, the odds are 50-50. And this quarter doesn't remember the past. Like, those past events have no influence on how this particular coin toss is going to turn out. So just because I flip the coin 10 heads in a row does not mean that the next one is probably going to be tails. Doesn't mean that the next one's probably going to be heads either. Although 10 times in a row you might start to be suspicious that, like, maybe this is not a fair coin. Maybe it's weighted funny. You should expect the next one to be 50-50. And this is the sort of thing that, like, people who gamble poorly get suckered into. They say, that slot machine's due to pay out, hasn't won in a while. Nope, it's brand new odds every time you pull the lever. The roulette wheel hasn't turned up black in a while. I'm betting on black. Why? Why? There are just as many black slots as red slots on the wheel. The odds are 50-50 every time you spin it. over time, we would expect that it'll balance out, but that tells me nothing about any one particular instance. Somebody brought up an example in the last section about taking a multiple choice test. Have you ever been in this situation where it's just kind of like, question 1, the answer is C. Question 2, the answer is C. Question 3, God, like 5 C's in a row. Does this kind of freak you out when that happens? And if you get to like question number 6 and you're kind of like, C looks like a tempting answer, but also A looks like a tempting answer, are you inclined to think like, well, probably A, right? Because 6 C's in a row? That's insane.
You have to go back and find out which one was wrong.
Yeah. Nope. Those previous questions have nothing to do with what the correct answer is on question 6, right? So let's not falsely assume that past trends are relevant to future events in some genuinely random system. That's the gambler's fallacy. Questions about that? All right. Good old friend, slippery slope. Have you heard of this one before? The slippery slope fallacy. This is a nice one. It gets used an awful lot. And again, what's kind of tempting and compelling about it is that it does kind of trade on an idea that there's some serious truth to it. Sometimes folks will refer to, the boiling frog phenomenon. Have you heard of this boiling frog phenomenon? I don't even know if this is actually true, but sometimes people talk about, if you drop a frog in boiling water, that frog is going to jump right out of the boiling water. It's going to be like, no thank you. If you put a frog in room temperature water and turn the heat up, raise the temperature about 10 degrees, slowly the frog will get used to it. And then if you turn it up a little more, the frog will get used to that. You turn it up a little more, the frog will get used to that. You can, if you do it slowly enough, people say, again, I don't know if this is actually true, but is it true? Have you done this? Have you seen this?
Country living? Yeah, it's true.
Ugh.
There we have it, humane way to kill a frog.
A humane way to kill a frog? Yeah.
It happens. No, I didn't make it happen.
You just, all right.
I was a kid.
Either way, I fear that we're
Science experience.
I fear that we're getting off track here. So the idea here is, and sometimes this is referred to as the camel's nose problem as well, that like and we all know how pesky a camel can be when you're in your tent. If the camel gets its nose into the tent, well, pretty soon it's going to get its whole head into the tent. And once it's got its head into the tent, then its neck is probably next. And then it'll get its shoulders in, and pretty soon the whole camel's in the tent. And who wants that, right? Better to just stop the camel, like don't even let it get its nose in the tent, right? And maybe there's something reasonable about this. And maybe there's some truth to the idea that if you make changes slowly enough, people can become kind of acclimatized to the change, where they're going to be more receptive to the next change. And then if we do that one, now they'll become more receptive to the next change. And eventually we might get led down a path where at the beginning we would have said, like, I don't want to go there. But by the end of it, like, we went in little steps where nobody objected to any of the particular steps. Does that make sense? And that's the sort of thing that we want to be careful about, because people do have this tendency that, like, once you've gotten used to something, the next little step doesn't seem so bad anymore. At the same time, just because a whole series of steps leads someplace bad doesn't mean that the first step is necessarily a bad idea. For example, physician-assisted suicide should not be allowed. If we were to allow patients to voluntarily end their own life with the aid of a medical professional, it's just a matter of time before those medical professionals start recommending euthanasia to patients. We've gone from allowing people to say, I want my doctor to help me die, to now the doctors are recommending to some patients that maybe they should consider physician-assisted suicide. Once we've gotten there, it's a small step to ending the lives of patients who can't communicate about their willingness to die or lack thereof. So somebody who just, like, they can't speak, or they're unconscious, they're in a persistent vegetative state. We're going to say, like, we don't know whether they want it or not, but we'll look at it and we'll say, like, that doesn't seem like good life. We'll kill them whether they request it or not. And once that happens, what's to stop doctors from deciding to kill patients who don't want to die at all? That would be unacceptable. The only reasonable option here is to not start down this road to begin with. It's true. Can we see from the boiling frog perspective that, like, if we took one step, and if we got used to that, the next one wouldn't seem as bad, and the next one wouldn't seem as bad? But where this becomes fallacious is we might say something like, that slope isn't really all that slippery. I can maybe spot exactly where it goes from okay to not okay. What do you guys think? Is the physician-assisted suicide, is that okay? Raise your hand if you think if a patient wants to die and they can't do it themselves, should they be able to get their physician to help them do it in the most humane and least painful way? Some people saying yes. Not everybody, though. All right, cool. What about the next step? Do you think it's okay that doctors should be able to recommend this or at least propose it as an option for their patients? We got a little bit less. What about the third step where we don't know what the patient wants? So we'll let the doctor be the judge and say like, all right, we're going to end this patient's life because they can't say no. Who thinks that one's okay? Maybe that's where we draw the line, right? Maybe we say step 1 and step 2 are fine. And somebody's like, what's to stop us from going to step 3? And we're like, we are. We're all to stop us. We're all deciding right now. We'll do steps 1 and 2, but not step 3. That's where it goes from okay to not okay.
Step 3 seems like it would depend on the circumstance.
Yeah, and we might also point out that like a version of step 3 already does happen. Yeah, if it's withholding care, if we're just kind of saying like, we don't know what their wishes are, they don't have a DNR, but they don't also say like, do whatever you can to like save me, and they're comatose or they're in a persistent vegetative state, we might pull the plug. And a lot of people seem to think that like, yeah, that's one thing, but making a positive intervention instead of just withholding care to like maybe give them an injection that's going to stop their heart, that's a different thing altogether. And we might make those discrete steps in this too. We might say pulling the plug, withholding care, and we're like, that one's okay. Well, what about positive interventions? And we go, ooh, that one's different and not okay. And somebody might say, the difference between the two is not very clear. Once we agree to one, we might be inclined to agree to the other. And we can say, thanks for pointing that out. We'll be careful about that. We'll make sure that we don't slip. Just because the slope is slippery doesn't mean you're going to slip. You can be mindful of the slipperiness and say like, all right, here's where we're going to cut it off. Maybe we'll all sign a pledge that like, we'll only go to step 2, no further. And then once we get there, we might say like, we want to go to step 3. Yes?
To me, the grounds to not go to step 3 sound
Morally relative? Do you mean that people are going to disagree about it?
Like, I guess what I'm saying is, well, if you are allowing step 1 and 2, why wouldn't you allow step 3?
I can think of a really pretty, like a very clear reason for why steps 1 and 2 are very, very different than step 3. Steps 1 and 2 allow the patient to make their own decisions. Step 3 doesn't let the patient make their own decision. And that's maybe the most important part. Like, I'm respecting the patient's autonomy in steps 1 and 2, but not in step 3. Yes?
I'm confused what the slippery slope is referring to. It seems like this argument structure is very common.
It is.
Especially in politics.
Yes.
You allow this, you allow that.
Yeah. If we start with any form of gun control, then pretty soon the government's going to come and take all your guns. So no gun control at all. And you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's clearly a slippery slope argument.
So is this the slippery slope referring to the argument structure, or are we allowed to actually go step by step? Because I think that's very obvious to go step by step.
Yeah. The slippery slope argument is saying, and do we get like why it's called slippery slope? It's saying like take one step on that slippery slope and pretty soon zoop, you're like sliding all the way down it because it's so slippery. And some slopes are slippery, and we should definitely be careful about them. The structure of this fallacious argument is to say that because the end of this series of steps is unacceptable, you shouldn't even take the first step. And why this is tricky is sometimes that's a reasonable sort of thing to say. We shouldn't take the first step because it's going to be very difficult for us to stop ourselves from sliding from that first step all the way to the last one, which we can all agree is unacceptable. But if we can point out that like it's possible to not slide all the way down, if we can say like here's a clear place to cut it off, then it seems like that argument shouldn't necessarily be compelling. Here's another reason that's more about kind of like induction, more kind of directly targeting induction, especially the mathematical and statistical aspects of induction that relates to slippery slopes as well. So let's kind of strip away any of like the content in this example. Let's just say I'm going to take step A, step B, step C, and step D. And let's say that looking at step A and we're wondering like what are the chances that we think that like people are going to want to take step A, and we'll say there's a 90% chance that people are going to want to take step A. And once they've taken step A, how likely is it that we think that folks are going to want to take step B? And we say there's a 90% chance once they've taken step A, folks are going to want to take step B. Once they've taken step B, what are the chances that they're going to want to take step C? And we'll say there's a 90% chance that they'll take step C. Once they've done that, what's the chance about step D? What do you think? 90% chance? 90% chance that they'll take step D. All those chances looked really likely, right? Each of those steps looked incredibly likely. Is there a 90% chance that we'll go all the way through?
No, that's in the inverse.
Yeah, it's not quite, but it's definitely bad statistics. 90% chance of taking one step, and then a 90% chance of the next step, and then the next step is 90% chance, and then the next step is 90%. What's the chances of doing all 4 steps? How would you determine this? 90% times 90% times 90% times 90%, which is 9.
Those 90s were there?
It's not 9 times 4. It's 9 times 9 times 9 times 9. 65% chance, yeah. There's a 65% chance of doing all 4 of the steps. Do we see how that looked way more likely than it actually is? That looked like each of those steps was very likely, but doing them all in a row, considerably less likely. 65% chance is a better chance than not, but maybe not enough to be super confident in, depending on what's on the line. So this is a kind of more of a statistical approach to the problem that's going on in a slippery slope. It's that we somehow think that because each of the steps is probable, that the whole concatenation of steps is also probable, and like, nope, that's not how probabilities work. That's not how math works. That's our friend slippery slope. Last but not least, false cause fallacy. False cause fallacy, because we're running a little short on time, I'm only going to gesture vaguely at this, because we haven't started talking about causal arguments at all, and that's what we're doing next week. We're going to talk about arguments where we say, I think that this thing is causing this other thing, and that's my conclusion that I'm drawing. We're going to wonder, like, what sorts of premises are going to make that sort of conclusion reasonable? And here are some of the mistakes that we can make when we make those sorts of arguments. I can engage in what's known as a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Literally, this means after which, therefore, because of which. This is a great example that demonstrates just how silly it is to say that just because one thing happens after another, it must have been caused by the first thing. Every morning, my neighbor's rooster crows, and then about 30 minutes later, the sun rises. I think it's safe to assume that the rooster is causing the sun to rise. Not necessarily, right? Okay. So here's one where we can confuse cause and effect. That just because 2 things seem to happen coincidentally, just because they tend to come together, and maybe they are even causally related to one another. I don't necessarily know that A is causing B or B is causing A, right? I don't necessarily know which direction the causation runs. We'll talk about that a little bit next week, and like whether or not we can try to figure out which way that causation runs. The common cause fallacy is when I notice that 2 things seem to be causally linked, and therefore I think that one is a cause of the other, or the other is the cause of the one, when in fact what's going on is there's some third thing that's causing them both. A nice example of this is when we're talking about disease symptoms. So first I got a fever, and then later I started getting these blisters all over my skin. I think the fever caused the blisters. This is not like the rooster making the sun crow up, sun come up, the rooster crowing making the sun come up. Maybe it is similar to that, actually. Is the fever causing the blisters? Are the blisters causing the fever? Are they causally related at all? Is there a virus that's causing both the fever and the blisters? That's what it is, right? They have some common cause. One is not causing the other. They're both caused by some third thing. And last but not least, we can talk about a complex cause fallacy. This involves reducing, kind of oversimplifying some kind of causal phenomenon to just saying like there's one thing that's causing the effect. When the truth is, most of the times when something is caused, there are a whole bunch of contributing causes all coming together to make the effect happen, right? If you hadn't been trying to cross the street, then you wouldn't have been hit by that car. So I think that we can safely say that you are responsible for this accident and not the driver. Yes, your causing the street was a contributing factor. Perhaps the driver talking on their phone while driving was another contributing factor, and maybe a more important one when we're attributing responsibility, right? Okay. Those are all false cause fallacies. They're a member of the bigger family of fallacies of weak induction, which are just, another family of all the fallacies that we've been discussing in general. You've got a worksheet. We are down to 0 time left. Would you mind hanging on just for a second so we can go through just a couple of these worksheet questions? Because the homework is going to be really, really similar. Okay. So take a look at number 1. See if you can identify what fallacy is being committed there and what family it belongs to. What do you think? You got an answer? Was that too fast? Repeated studies have shown that men are, on average, physically stronger than women are, on average. Is that true? I think that's fairly safe to say. I don't want to seem like sexist or something, but I think this is a biological fact. Stephen Hawking's a man and Venus Williams is a woman. Therefore, I think it's safe to conclude that Stephen Hawking is probably physically stronger than Venus Williams. What's going on there? I started out with a general rule about men on average being stronger than women on average. That general rule is fine. Does it have exceptional cases? Am I somehow assuming that Stephen Hawking and Venus Williams are not exceptional cases? So I'm applying a general rule without sensitivity to whether or not the case in question is an exception to the rule or fits the rule. Which fallacy is that? Accident, aka sweeping generalization, right? This is a badly done statistical syllogism. And that is a sweeping generalization fallacy. Belongs to the fallacy of weak induction family. Let's look at number 2 real quick, and then we'll all start our weekends. My friend takes a city bus to school every day, and it usually takes about 10 minutes to get from his house to campus. I drive to work every day, and it also takes me about 10 minutes to get home from campus. To get from home to campus. We all know that the city buses don't break the speed limit. So you can see, officer, I can't have been speeding, as I was probably going just as fast as the city buses. What kind of argument is this trying to be? It's an analogy, yeah. It's tempting to be an analogical induction. Are there similarities between the two cases? Yeah. My friend goes on the bus and doesn't break the speed limit, and it takes him 10 minutes. I take 10 minutes too, therefore I must not have been breaking the speed limit. That might be a relevant similarity. What's the important relevant difference that might be overlooked here? The distance between my house and the campus and my friend's house and the campus, right? Yeah, okay. If I live twice as far away from him, if I'm going to make that in the same amount of time, I'm going to go twice as fast and possibly break the speed limit. That makes it a bad analogy, a weak analogy, which is a member of the family of fallacies of weak induction. Your homework is going to be similar to this. It'll be multiple choice. I'll hit you with an argument. I'll ask you which fallacy is being committed. And so good luck with that, and good luck with the argument analysis draft number 1. And enjoy your weekend.